The exact location of King Solomon's most sacred and coveted treasure, the legendary Golden Menorah, isn't the one history books have spent centuries forcing us to swallow. Forget the old fables about impenetrable vaults in the Vatican's basement or secret catacombs in the heart of Rome. While legions of relic hunters and academics spend their entire lives sniffing out the trail of loot left by General Titus's troops in 70 AD, the harsh reality is that they have been digging in the wrong place for nearly 2 millennia. The uncomfortable truth, whispered by eyewitnesses to the fall of the Second Temple and carved into Byzantine maps that time tried to bury, reveals a masterful escape maneuver. The massive candelabrum forged from a single piece of pure gold to house the divine light itself never made the boat trip to the empire's capital. It was swallowed by the earth long before Roman boots marched over the rubble of Jerusalem. There is a millennia-old network, a vault armored by the bowels of the rock itself, whose exact coordinates have always been hidden right under our noses. What separates us from the greatest find in biblical archaeology isn't a lack of clues. Where was this light actually buried? The grandeur of the Golden Menorah, forged with millimeter precision to house the presence of the divine, is not a delusion swallowed by the realm of legends. Finding the whereabouts of this priceless treasure has always been the greatest challenge, the true Achilles heel of biblical archaeology. For centuries, we've seen highly regarded experts beat their heads against the wall. They've turned damp catacombs in Europe upside down, scoured dusty caves in the unforgiving desert, and bet on endless theories about secret orders. They made a lot of noise, sweated bullets, but came back empty-handed. Do you know why? Because they failed to connect the exact data. We took the opposite path. Through a meticulous investigation, we went to the archives few dare to open. We cross-referenced Byzantine maps forgotten by time with sacred texts that official history tried to silence, aligning it all with cutting-edge geological discoveries. The result led us to an underground chamber carved deep into the rock, a formidable natural vault that impresses with its sheer solidity and defies the very resistance of the materials in that mountainous region. It's a location that not only fits all the pieces of this colossal enigma with frightening perfection, but completely shatters everything you've been taught about the fate of Solomon's wealth. The veil is being torn, and you are about to discover the exact geographic spot where this sacred light waits in the dark. Before we take the next step into the depths of this discovery, leave a like on the video, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss upcoming revelations, and in the comments, write an Amen or leave your favorite prayer. I make it a point to read every single one of your comments. For centuries, the official narrative has shoved a very convenient version of events down our throats. The off-the-shelf tradition, the one repeated in school books, brings the gavel down by saying the menorah was looted by General Titus's legions in the fateful year 70 AD. The classic image, arrogantly sculpted on the famous Arch of Titus in Italy, shows Roman soldiers parading the imposing 7-branched candelabrum as the ultimate spoil of war. From that stone, the almost unquestionable myth was born that the final destination of this sacred piece would be the heart of the Roman Empire, and that today it sits locked away in Vatican vaults. And there was no shortage of big shots spending rivers of money and decades of their lives trying to find this needle in the European haystack. But this is exactly where the official story stops adding up. When we start dusting off lesser-known historical documents, the ones traditional academia often prefers to sweep under the rug because they don't fit the consensus, the picture changes completely. Accounts from eyewitnesses and Jewish historians contemporary to the siege bring evidence that is a real punch to the gut of the Roman narrative. The prime example is Flavius Josephus, a Jewish commander who survived and reported the horror of Jerusalem's fall in rich detail. When we cross-reference his records with other sources from the time, a massive loophole appears in the victor's version. The evidence that shouldn't exist points out that the pure gold menorah never set foot outside the Jerusalem region. It sounds crazy to clash head-on with the history of the almighty Roman Empire, but think with me with the cold logic of an investigator. The temple priests weren't born yesterday. They saw the siege tightening. They knew the invasion was a done deal. Do you really believe they would leave the most valuable and sacred relic of their faith handed to them on a silver platter on the altar, waiting for the troops to come in and wipe the place clean? The idea that Rome wiped out everything might just be the greatest propaganda stunt of antiquity. The empire needed to show off a trophy to its people, of course. But there is a very strong possibility that the candelabrum paraded in Rome was a copy hastily arranged. Solomon's true treasure, the original, is not where we think. To understand the sheer size of the abyss that the menorah's disappearance left in history, we need to dive into the absurd weight this artifact carried. Forget the shallow idea that it was just a flashy candelabrum, an overly expensive decorative piece to dress up the altar. We are talking about an object whose instructions for making it came, according to the sacred texts, straight from above. The book of Exodus is surgical in describing that the menorah was hammered from a single solid talent of pure gold, which would be around 75 pounds of the most coveted metal of the time. No seams, shortcuts, or cheap soldering. It was an unparalleled masterpiece, forged with intricate details of branches, cups, knobs, and almond blossoms. But its financial value, which would make any emperor drool with greed, was irrelevant next to its absolute spiritual meaning. The menorah wasn't just a spotlight to brighten the restricted quarters of the holy place. It was the divine light itself, materialized among the people. The 7 flames that burned without interruption on its branches, fueled day and night only with the finest cold-pressed olive oil, represented God's unceasing watchfulness, wisdom, and the promise of eternity for the nation. There were entire teams of priests whose sole mission in life was to never let that light go out under any circumstances. The central flame served as the unbreakable bridge between heaven and earth, the visual guarantee that the Creator kept his house lit and protected. Without the golden light of the menorah, the majestic temple of Jerusalem was nothing more than a massive cold stone mansion. Try to put yourself in those people's shoes and imagine the visceral despair, the brutal psychological impact of seeing the city walls giving way day after day to the siege of the Roman legions. Losing that candelabrum to profane hands wasn't just a run-of-the-mill military defeat. It was like having the very backbone of their faith fractured. It was such a devastating blow that it left a spiritual mourning spanning centuries. It is exactly this vital importance that fuels the mystery and the sweat of kings, archaeologists, and scholars to this day. Finding the menorah is not about gold or academic fame. It's about rekindling an ancient hope. And it was the terror of seeing this light profaned that forced the temple elite to execute the most brilliant and silent escape plan in history. And so you can perfectly grasp the unfolding of all these grandiose events without getting lost in dates. It's essential to put the historical puzzle together the right way. If you like to dive deep and get out of the shallow end, check out our ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order, From Genesis to Revelation. It's a fantastic resource that untangles your mind, allowing you to read the scriptures as the greatest epic narrative ever written, following events exactly as they happened. The link is right here in the pinned comment, and it is worth every single page read. Let's go back in time, not with the romantic and peaceful view of textbooks, but with the cold lens of a criminal investigation at the crime scene. The year 70 AD. The siege of Jerusalem wasn't just an ordinary pitched battle. It was a slow, methodical, and brutal strangulation. General Titus's relentless legions surrounded the city with an unbreakable wall of stakes, cutting off any escape or supply route at the root. The smell of smoke, dust, and death hung in the thick air. The heavy, constant sound of Roman battering rams smashing against the stone walls was like a macabre clock, announcing the end of days for the glorious Second Temple. But while absolute pandemonium reigned in the streets and despair took over the population outside, at the epicenter of the sacred complex, a very select group of men operated in absolute silence and cold blood. The high priests and top-tier Levites weren't just standing there paralyzed, arms crossed, waiting for the cedar roof to cave in on their heads. They had a strict emergency protocol, a masterful Plan B that official history, written by the hands of the victors, made sure to erase. Modern archaeological evidence, driven by cutting-edge excavations under the Temple Mount and the ancient city of David, has revealed something jaw-dropping. Beneath that sacred limestone soil, there wasn't just dirt and solid rock. There was a literal anthill of stone, a complex hidden network of tunnels, spiraling water ducts, and secret chambers. We're not talking about sketchy holes dug in a moment of panic. This was a maximum security infrastructure, evasion engineering designed decades, or perhaps centuries earlier, precisely for an imminent doomsday scenario. Only the cream of the priesthood held the mental map to this subterranean maze. When the massive main gates began to give way under Roman fury and fire licked the curtains of the outer courtyard, the silent order was given. The goal wasn't to save their own skins, it was to rescue the soul of the nation. And at the absolute top of that priority list was, without a shadow of a doubt, the Golden Menorah. Stop for a second and imagine the military-level operation required to quickly move a massive piece of about 75 pounds of pure gold in the dim light right under the nose of the deadliest army in the world. The sacred flames, which had burned vigilantly for generations, were extinguished with grief and haste. The priceless candelabrum was camouflaged, likely wrapped in heavy skins to hide its telltale gleam, and lowered into Jerusalem's dark underworld. When Rome's soldiers finally smashed through the bronze doors of the inner sanctuary, panting and with greed blinding their reason, the main room had already been emptied of its greatest prize. They charged in furiously to loot Solomon's legendary wealth, but what they found was the echo of footsteps that were no longer there. The smoke of destruction threw the Romans off the scent, but the real escape happened silently right beneath the soles of their military sandals. And this is exactly where we hit the big knot of this story. the riddle that keeps the greatest archaeologists up at night. If these intricate tunnels served as an escape route for the authentic menorah, where did they lead? And even more intriguing, why did the Romans, famous for their rigid bureaucracy and for cataloging every single coin of their plunder, never record the exact dimensions and the capture of the original menorah in their official war inventories? The artifact, carried in triumph and sculpted on the Arch of Titus, was in all likelihood a replica used for daily service, left behind as bait. The historical and archaeological math simply doesn't add up. The true golden candelabrum never boarded the Empire's ships. It went down into the bowels of the earth, and the crucial clue to where this underground journey ended remained hidden in plain sight for a very long time. When an artifact of the magnitude of Solomon's menorah vanishes, the void left behind isn't filled with silence, but with the deafening noise of theories and speculation. Over 2 millennia, we've heard it all, from the most pragmatic hypotheses to narratives that seem straight out of a movie script. Now, let's put the main suspects in the spotlight and confront what actually makes sense. It's exactly here, in the clash of ideas, that the smokescreen clears and the truth starts to shine through. You are the jury, so pay close attention to the flaws in each argument. The first theory, and perhaps the most bitter one for passionate historians, is melting. Part of the academic community argues that the Romans, despite loving to show off trophies, were first and foremost calculatingly cold military men. According to this view, the original menorah wouldn't have lasted a month. The solid gold would have been tossed into the fire and turned into coins to pay the legion's wages. It's a logical hypothesis, no doubt, but it ignores a crucial factor of the ancient world's psychology: the incalculable value of an intact religious trophy. Parading the ultimate symbol of the God of Israel in Rome was a political propaganda weapon infinitely more powerful than a chest of generic coins. Destroying the candelabrum would be a strategic waste for an empire that fed on publicly humiliating the faith of conquered nations. The second clue leads us almost automatically to Europe. The theory that the candelabrum was buried under some forgotten ruin in Rome, or that it rests today in the Vatican's armored vaults, is repeated like a mantra. After all, the majestic Arch of Titus shows the military procession carrying the piece, right? But the narrative hits a brick wall of reality. If the true menorah ended up in the center of the empire, what happened when Rome was mercilessly sacked by the Vandals centuries later? The trail simply vanishes into thin air. Relic hunters have already scoured the Roman catacombs to the point of exhaustion, burned through untold fortunes, and haven't found even the shadow of a golden branch. We also have those theories that sell millions of books involving secret orders like the Templars. They supposedly excavated the temple foundations during the Crusades, taking the menorah to strongholds in Europe. It's a breathtaking story, I won't deny it. But when we act as investigators and demand documents from the time, these narratives collapse like a house of cards. The same rigorous skepticism applies to the idea that priestly families would have broken the relic into pieces to make the escape easier. Go back to what we just talked about. The menorah was sacred in God's eyes exactly because it was a unique piece forged from a single block. For the priests, sawing or mutilating the divine candelabrum would be an absolute sacrilege. They would rather lay down their own lives than profane the treasure with their own hands. The hypothesis that gains the most traction among realists points to the Judean desert. We know that priceless treasures from that era, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, were hidden in inhospitable caves. The mysterious copper scroll even lists hiding places for gold in the region. It would make perfect sense if it weren't for a brutal logistical detail. Dragging a massive 75-pound block of gold through the scorching desert, trying to shake off the siege and the relentless Roman patrols, would be signing a quick death warrant. The logistics of this escape simply don't hold up on paper. And this is the point where our puzzle reaches its climax. None of these theories manage to tie up the story's most critical loose ends. The proven existence of the tunnel network beneath the temple and the silence of Roman loot inventories regarding the exact measurements of the original menorah. If the piece wasn't melted in the furnaces, isn't in Rome, didn't cross the ocean with medieval knights, and wasn't dragged into the desert, the equation seems unsolvable. All these theories fall short due to a lack of documentary backing. The key to flipping this game and uncovering its final whereabouts came from a forgotten Byzantine document that official history preferred to ignore, hiding archaeology's greatest secret right under our noses. The turning point in this hunt, the detail most academics glossed over while obsessively looking toward Europe, came from an unbelievable cross-referencing of information. For centuries, the world focused in the wrong directions, until a 6th century Byzantine map, rediscovered and studied under a new lens, brought a jaw-dropping revelation. This document isn't a generic sketch. It maps out Jerusalem with a precision that makes conventional wisdom uncomfortable. It's here that the mystery unravels. There's a direct mention of temple treasures in an area off the Roman radar, east of the Old City, across the historic Kidron Valley. Pay close attention to this geographic detail, because it changes the rules of the game. The clue doesn't point to makeshift hiding spots or shallow tunnels dug in a rush. What the Byzantines recorded was a formidable structure, a natural underground network, a labyrinth of caves sculpted by nature over ages, secretly adapted by the priests to be a maximum security vault. It's an armor of solid rock, infinitely more impenetrable than any surface fortress. For the guardians of the sacred, using the hidden topography to their advantage was a masterstroke. Rome would never look for Solomon's wealth in the bowels of the raw earth. To shatter the skepticism, the investigation finds backing in another invaluable source. This Kidron Valley region, often ignored by the old guard of archaeology, gains colossal weight when cross-referenced with Hebrew texts from the Middle Ages. Sages who preserved the echoes of oral tradition described deep wells at the exact same coordinates as the map. Out of fear of mercenaries, they didn't speak openly. Instead, they used veiled codes, leaving cryptic instructions for the path that would lead to the Chamber of Light. Chamber of Light. Think about it with me. What biblical artifact would justify such a poetic and reverent title other than the Golden Menorah itself, the eternal flame of God's presence? When you overlay the Byzantine map with the medieval coordinates, the historical math lines up in a way that gives you chills. The evidence moves away from shallow guesswork and points like an arrow to a surprising place. The treasure has always been protected by the silence of the rock, waiting for someone to connect the dots ignored by history. With the puzzle pieces finally on the table, the most solid hypothesis, the one that truly stands up to historical scrutiny, points straight to the rocky escarpment east of Jerusalem. more specifically, under the sacred soil of what we know today as the Mount of Olives. We're not talking about just any hole, but a formidable geological complex that hides a literal web of natural grottos and ancient water cisterns, accessible only through passages that nature itself managed to camouflage. Think about the tactical genius behind this. This strategic location allowed the temple elite to move the menorah and the other treasures with relative safety, even with the Roman siege raging just yards away. The steep slope and the underground network formed the perfect escape route. Once inside, the chamber was sealed for good. The divine treasure wasn't just protected by a secret kept tightly under wraps by the surviving priests, but by the labyrinthine and hostile nature of the terrain itself. Of course, in the archaeology world, dropping the gavel without having the physical piece in your hands is always a risk. We don't have definitive excavation proof yet. But when you cross-reference the mathematical precision of the Byzantine map, the veiled accounts in medieval texts, and the actual topography of the Mount of Olives, the convergence is overwhelming. This is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most likely hiding spot. Solomon's treasure found its refuge beneath the very earth that saw it born. But if the evidence points so clearly to the bowels of the Mount of Olives, why aren't the excavators out there yet? The answer is harsh and unforgiving. Excavating in Jerusalem, especially in an area of such holiness, is a Herculean task. It's not just about drilling through the ancient limestone. It's about walking blind through a literal geopolitical minefield. Access to the site is extremely restricted, shielded by diplomatic agreements hanging by a thread, where a single misstep has the power to trigger conflicts of international proportions. Today's bureaucracy has built a wall much larger than the Romans' own. Add to that the brutal physical obstacle. The exact depth of this natural network demands absurdly precise technology, capable of mapping and penetrating the solid rock without causing catastrophic cave-ins. The million-dollar question is no longer, where is the menorah, but rather, what's really stopping its rediscovery? Could it just be the understandable dread of an unprecedented diplomatic crisis? Or are there even greater interests in keeping Solomon's treasure hidden from humanity for a few more generations? The golden light of the temple is still down there, intact, in the deep silence of its stone vault, just waiting for the exact, predestined moment to shine once again. If the Golden Menorah, with all its historical and spiritual weight, truly rests in absolute silence beneath the dirt of the Mount of Olives, just waiting for the clock of history to chime so it can be rediscovered, the big question hanging in the air is, what would this colossal revelation mean for the modern world? Stop and think about the impact of that. We're talking about the beating heart of an ancient faith rising back to the surface. Would the physical encounter with this priceless relic be a miraculous catalyst for peace among nations, uniting people in reverence? Or, on the contrary, would it be the ultimate spark for new devastating conflicts in the Middle East? The power of a symbol of this magnitude goes way, way beyond the borders of religion and the dusty shelves of archaeology. It messes with our roots, with our human essence. What is, at the end of the day, the real value of an artifact so sacred and at the same time so intensely coveted by men throughout the centuries? What do you think would happen if the menorah were brought into the sunlight tomorrow? Is humanity truly ready to handle that weight? Drop your opinion down below in the comments. I really want to know what you think, because your perspective adds so much to our debate. And our journey searching for the truths left out of the history books doesn't stop here. In our next meeting, we're going to open a chapter that a lot of people have tried to keep locked up tight. We're going to take a deep dive into the myths, truths, and mysteries of the enigmatic Book of Enoch. What is so revealing about these ancient texts? Why did the Catholic Church decide to ban it from its official canons? Could there be even more monumental secrets hidden in plain sight from all of us? Subscribe and get ready, because the truth always finds a way.